Okay, I think we should start. Thank you all for coming along. First of all, an acknowledgement to country. This event is taking place on the unceded land, the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. It's my great pleasure here today to welcome you to this next InfUr seminar where we have Hesam Kamalipour, who's going to talk about informal urban design. It's been one of our tactics in the InfUr Hub to try and range across the different disciplines that are engaged with urban informality, from architecture through urban design and planning to geography, and to do that with our guests as well. So we go from geography from Jenny Robinson last time to Hesam Kamalipour. Hesam, this is a welcome back in many ways, although Hesam is in Cardiff, along probably quite early in the morning in Cardiff. It's a cold Melbourne late afternoon here. Hesam is it's a welcome back because he's a former PhD student from our faculty, and where he was one of the first people, probably globally really, to do a PhD on informal urban design, and indeed invented a field which he called informality. He's now, and has been for some time, a senior lecturer in, first of all, lecturer, and now senior lecturer in urban design at the School of Geography and Planning at the University of Cardiff, where he's also the co-founding director of the Public Space Observatory Research Centre and the co-director of the MA in Urban Design, which is co-taught between architecture and geography and planning. So Hesam's work lies in an understanding of the dynamics of informal urbanism in relation to urban design. And he most recently has published a lot in many different journals globally, including all of the top urban design journals. And he most recently co-edited a handbook, a really important project, which is the first and very broad Routledge Handbook of Urban Design Research Methods. So he has been proceeding in a range of different ways, and we're keen to see what he has to talk to us about this afternoon. We have changed venue because it turns out that there's a formal structure of the faculty where the executive can override our room bookings. So we lost the Japanese room, and we're now in the room 201, where we're fitting quite snugly, thank you very much. So it's much more intimate than it usually is. So I'm going to hand over to Hesam, and then we will have some discussion when he has finished talking. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim and the InfUr team, for the kind invitation, and also the kind of generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I think without further ado, I'm going to start sharing the screen and start the presentation. Also, hello everyone from the relatively rainy Cardiff today, and let's start then. So hope everyone can see the screen soon.
It takes a while.
Okay.
Can you try again?
Sure, I think it should be there now. Is it on screen now? Can everyone see the screen?
Not yet, but it will come. Yes, we have to wait a few seconds.
Great. Okay, great. So
wait.
We can't see the screen.
But, hold on. I think just like the last time. It broke. And try once more.
You have a copy of the presentation.
Yes, sharing the screen. So let's see.
It's too high resolution. Yeah.
Hopefully is now there.
Yeah. No.
Perfect.
Great. So yes, thanks everyone, and it's my pleasure to be here, although virtually, back at the University of Melbourne. A pleasure also to join the team, the InfUr team, particularly Kim and Victor, who have kindly invited me and arranged the session, and all the team working on topics related to informal urbanism. So today I'll discuss my research exploring the intersections of urban design, informal urbanism, public space, urban morphology, and comparative urbanism. I will primarily focus on the challenge of understanding the dynamics of informal urbanism in relation to urban design in particular, and the ways in which different forms of informality work in a global context. As many of us know, the greatest challenges for urban futures can be found in cities of the global south. One must look hard and closely at cities in the global south where forms of urban informality play a key role in how places are being made, unmade, and remade by many, including the ordinary population. Informal urbanism incorporates a range of activities that often take place beyond, yet often in relation to state control. Informal settlements, informal street vending, and informal transport can be considered as primary forms of informal urbanism, and my research looked at these three in particular in isolation from each other, and more recently in relation to each other. While forms of urban informality have become integral to how cities work, particularly in the global south, it is important to note, of course, that forms of informality are by no means limited to the global south. It is also important to avoid conflating informal urbanism with emerging forms of temporary and tactical urbanism. Temporary appropriations can be organized through both informal and formal processes, also making that distinction between desire and need when it comes to informal urbanism and how forms of informality work is critical. Forms of informality are here to stay, although they may often remain invisible. In what follows in my presentation, I will mainly focus on my research on street vending and informal settlements out of other forms of informality. And the main aim here is not to adopt pessimistic or optimistic approaches to informal urbanism, but rather to explore how forms of urban informality work in relation to formality in a global context. The concept of informality is associated with the articulation of the informal sector back in 1970s, the work of Hart and others afterward. Urban informality is, of course, a multidimensional concept that cannot be accurately or thoroughly defined, making a binary division between what is known or what can be considered as informal and formal is also a reductionist approach, as urban informality plays out in relation to formality across different contexts. In my work, I consider urban informality as at once a way of thinking and a form of practice, and at the same time a process and a product which is associated with a range of individual and collective fears and desires across different scales and contexts. So there has been a surge of interest in investigating the dynamics of informal street vending, motivated mostly by the need to address economic, social, and political inequalities. We took stock of this literature, bringing together various streams of research on informal street vending, particularly in the global south. And our review of the relevant literature revealed at least 8 key themes, including gender, type, spatiality of street vending and public space design, health and well-being, individual collective agency, policy environment, use of technology, and links to other forms of informality. A range of gaps and emerging questions, such as the impact of tourism on street vendors' livelihoods, gender mobilities, and experiences of ethnic minority street vendors, exposure to violence and crime among street vendors, and how class, race, and space inform street vendors' experiences. Socioeconomic forces deriving street vendors' motivations, temporal organization of street vending activities, as well as time-space sharing design approaches for managing street vending. Street vendors also participate in local governance and decision-making processes, which has remained underexplored. And it's important to highlight the need for more comparative studies across different countries and cities to understand global dynamics of street vending, the importance of investigating informal street vending in understudied regions in particular, and also considering the diversity of street vending, theoretical and empirical research to inform interventions related to the spatiality and design of public space. A range of understudied themes, such as gender, use of technology, and links to other forms of informality, are among some of the key gaps in the relevant literature that need more empirical research to advance evidence-based understanding of how street vending works. We propose a typology of street trading based on the criteria of mobility within public space and proximity to public-private urban interfaces, and develop a matrix of 6 typical conditions reflecting these criteria. We also explored how street traders, shopkeepers, and state functionaries negotiate space and visibility, recognizing public space as a critical asset for street traders' livelihoods, and highlighted the need for more nuanced, context-specific approaches when it comes to planning and design interventions. We argued that street vending cannot be considered as marginal since it gears to the urban economy and works as a key mode of income generation for the urban poor to sustain their livelihoods, while exploring the degrees of mobility in informal street trading can be crucial to modes of governance and adaptability involved. Of critical importance is to investigate how street trading takes place in relation to the built form, in particular, the edges of public space where public-private interfaces enable or constrain social exchange and appropriation. A poor understanding of how forms of street trading work in public space can lead to poor design and policy interventions. While many practices of formalization aim at the elimination of informality, the challenge is to explore the complex informal-formal relations here and the dynamics of street trading to understand how forms of informality negotiate space and visibility in the public realm. Traders' ability to sustain livelihoods being linked to their negotiation of visibility in high pedestrian areas. Also, informal collaborations leading to monopolies and collective privatization of public space, and how visibility helps attract customers, but also risks state intervention and eviction in public space. In our empirical research following the previous work, we looked at a range of case studies in Tehran. We focused on mapping forms of informal street vending to explore the spatiality of street vending, one of the underexplored areas and a significant gap in the literature in relation to pedestrian flows, public-private interfaces, and functional mix, particularly in relation to urban design areas of concern. We highlighted the importance of spatial tactics used by vendors to remain competitive and further investigated the dynamics of street vending in relation to both human and non-human entities, including functional mix, ground floor storefronts, pedestrian flows, and gender in our study. Some of the key findings included that street vendors are attracted to high volumes of pedestrian traffic, empirically supported in our study, and functional mix and key urban attractions further mediating these high traffic areas, so that relationship between different elements of the built form. Informal vendors often concentrate in the same areas as formal stores, leading to competition and alliances that could benefit both parties. And also, ground floor storefronts with multiple subdivisions can slow pedestrian movement and enhance engagement with street edges. And how street vendors act as social catalysts, enhancing interaction and social dynamics in public spaces. The presence of vendors in particular, we notice, increases women's use of public space, providing a sense of safety and familiarity with place. Street vendors adopting spatial tactics to increase overlaps between catchment areas and pedestrian flows. Different types of vendors using various tactics to remain competitive and avoid conflicts, such as changing goods and services offered. Also, unfixed vendors showing high adaptability to changing pedestrian patterns, often maneuvering between more fixed types of vendors, catchment areas, and offering diverse goods and services. Adjacent types of street vendors, those that are located next to the edges of public space or rely on that, can activate and revitalize underused public-private edges, contributing to urban vitality in the public realm. Emerging spatial conflicts can also lead to the exclusion of particularly more vulnerable vendors unless adaptive measures are taken. And we also argue that simplistic urban management practices, such as organizing vendors into designated markets, may not address the nuanced needs of street vendors. Relocation efforts often fail due to lack of clientele and business potential in new location. We also found that gender disparities in street vending intersect with broader socioeconomic inequalities, contributing to gender-based marginalization, and how women vendors are often restricted to less prominent areas, reflecting broader gender norms and sociocultural constraints there. A substantial part of my research has focused on the challenge of understanding the dynamics of informal settlement as a key form of informal urbanism in relation to urban design and the ways in which different forms of informal settlement work in a global context. As you know, UN Habitat defines a slum household in terms of lack of one or more conditions regarding access to water, durability of housing structure, adequacy of living area, access to sanitation, and tenure security. The term slum, however, with its lasting connotations of overcrowding and disorder, indicates a condition rather than a housing type in many cases. It also conflates the issue of place with the characteristics of inhabitants, as argued by scholars such as Gelber. Slum has also been referred to as a deceitful construct that is particularly unhelpful due to the ways in which it compromises critical engagement with urban inequalities and mislead thinking about how they can possibly be addressed. I mainly use the term informal settlement in my research to highlight how it incorporates both the process and product of shaping place that typically unfolds individually and or collectively through generative, incremental, and adaptive processes to meet the needs and possibly the desires of the ordinary in these settlements. I also begin from a view that informal settlement cannot be simply reduced to housing, as it often incorporates a mix of multiple functions and activities in place. As illustrated here, it is also important to note that all urbanisms incorporate a mix of informal and formal processes. So when we talk about informal settlement, we are at the same time talking about the relations between informal settlements or what can be considered more formal parts of cities and places. So typology is often considered a useful tool that can provide a better understanding of typical conditions, particularly in this case regarding forms of informal settlement, by exploring and categorizing typical structures. A few years ago, we developed a multi-scale non-binary typology to provide a more nuanced understanding of informal-formal relations concerning the production of buildings and access networks in cities. Each axis incorporated 3 categories of formal, mixed, and informal, and our typology incorporated a matrix of 9 types illustrating a range of in-between conditions and avoiding making a binary distinction between what can be considered as formal and what can be considered as informal, looking at the process of self-organization, exploring the physical traces of self-organization concerning the production of buildings and access network is the key to distinguishing between formal and informal morphologies in this typology, which was further adopted for mapping the informal-formal morphologies across 15 cities, such as here, the city of Rio in Brazil, Caracas in Venezuela, Lima in Peru, and also other cities in other regions, such as Mumbai in India, Jakarta in Indonesia, Manila in Philippines, and also other cities in Africa and parts of Middle East, such as Nairobi in Kenya, Cape Town in South Africa, and Karachi in Pakistan. Informal settlements exhibit diverse morphologies, typologies, and morphogenesis processes, despite sharing needed further exploration across different cases and contexts. And here, where my research becomes quite relevant, much of my research on informal settlement aimed to address this significant gap in the literature, adopting a multi-scale approach, looking across different cases in different regions, from Southeast Asia to South Asia to Middle East, parts of Africa and South America in particular. Public space in informal settlements is often provisional and by and large subject to a range of appropriations. The access network is generally the only public space in informal settlements which is subject to forms of appropriation in relation to the dynamics of control. Negotiations can play a key role in addressing potential conflicts in informal settlements. The public space can become entirely or partly dysfunctional due to the escalation of incremental adaptations, where informal codes concerning the rights of airspace and light and ventilation in particular fall short to prevent the emergence of what is known as slum conditions in informal settlements. One of the key points here is that loose parts play a key role in how public spaces work in informal settlements. Managing loose parts then requires flexible coding to balance meeting everyday needs and maintaining public space functionality. What I call unfinished nature of public space in informal settlements provides a degree of flexibility for adaptation based on habitants' ever-changing needs and desires. Upgrading informal settlements then requires a more sophisticated approach to go beyond housing to include public spaces, the question of connectivity, and also the critical issue of permeability in public spaces. While informal settlement is a form of incremental urban design and planning, we know very little about how incremental urbanism works in reality. In one of our works, we suggested a typology of increments as a conceptual lens for understanding the emergence of informal settlement morphologies. We considered the ways residents extend and renovate buildings at macro spatial scales and identify typical increments of what we called at the time extending, attaching, replacing, dividing, connecting, and infilling. We also explored the informal rights and codes that govern the ways in which some increments encroach on public space. Rights of way in particular, air rights, and the right to light and ventilation. Some of the key highlights of our work included how increments of change are at once the materiality of the productive capacity of informality and the expressive manifestation of resistance and anticipation, in many cases for formalization and upgrading. While informal codes or rules are prescriptive and work through negotiation and consensus, they cannot necessarily prevent the emergence of slum conditions in many informal settlements. We need a change of mindsets as a result, not only from outcomes to codes and processes, but also from rigid to supple codes that can encompass the makeshift and temporary nature of how informal settlements work, enabling the productive capacities of incremental urbanism and constraining its destructive aspects are equally important when we wish to sustain adaptive capacities of informal settlements over time. Informal settlements also undergo continuous incremental changes, such as opening shops or adding rooms, which rely on long-term preparation and, in many cases, negotiation with neighbors. A typical functional mix in informal settlements includes shops at the ground level with residential units above, often located along main laneways and intersections to utilize pedestrian flows. This pattern supports the emergence of self-organized functional mixes in proximity to more integrated locations, adapting over time. Incremental design and construction practices meet everyday needs, but can also privatize public space, leading to what is known as the tragedy of the commons in the context of informal settlements, where competitive interests degrade public resources, in this particular case, public spaces in informal settlements. Governance of public space should then ideally balance individual household needs with community interests to avoid dysfunctional public spaces. We also highlighted the need to move beyond aestheticization and/or romanticization of informal settlement, recognizing its productive capacities while managing its critical challenges. In one of my work over the last few years, I looked at urban interfaces in particular. Urban interfaces play a key role in enabling the different forms of social and economic exchange and the ways in which open space is contested and appropriated in informal settlements. Many upgrading practices involve the transformation of public-private interfaces. I put forward a typology for analyzing and mapping public-private interfaces in informal settlements, drawing on multiple case studies in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and South America. A typology of 6 interface types is developed based on the criteria of proximity, which was mainly about the extent to which a private territory is close to the public space, and the criteria of connectivity, which was about the degree to which a private territory is connected to the public space. My work shed light particularly on the ways in which urban interfaces worked in informal settlements. Drawing on case studies of emerging settlements in Nigeria in the context of Africa, we mapped also the emergence and incremental transformations of access networks and buildings in particular, and further explored the configurational morphogenesis of incremental urbanism. Following the analysis of emerging access networks, we identified 3 primary types of change, namely adding, altering, and removing, and further developed a typology of emerging junctions by specifying 4 types of T, Y, X, and mixed-shape junctions in self-organized urban morphologies. We also identified 3 forms of relations between the emerging access networks and buildings, including access network first, building first, and co-production of access network and buildings in self-organized morphologies. The locations of the main local cores of the access network are found to remain relatively unchanged and somewhat fixed, even as emerging local cores come about in the newly developed areas. Our findings also show that flexibility in the early development can enable the emergence of irregular elements in the access network in the initial stages of development. The spatial circumstances of the studied settlements are also found to have impact on how the incremental adaptations and transformation generate new elements as parts of the access network. We also noticed that and suggested that the access network becomes less intelligible as it expands over time, and the settlement becomes more and more consolidated over time. One of the other aspects of my work looking at the morphogenesis in self-organized settlements, and particularly looking at the phenomenon of urban villages, or what is known as villages in the city, a focus on this issue. And cities in the global south, as you know, are experiencing rapid urbanization, through which various villages have become incorporated into the city and became what is known as villages in the city, or urban villages in some contexts. While villages in the city are here to stay, little is known about their morphogenesis, as they have generally been considered as part of the negative image of the city, and the related planning policies often tend to merely focus on eradication. We explore the morphogenesis of urban villages and map the incremental transformations of building footprints and access networks across multiple case studies in Hanoi City in Vietnam in one of our initial works. Some of our key findings included and pointed to how villages in the city are self-organized but not chaotic. Buildings and access networks co-evolve incrementally in relation to each other, and how villages in the city feature a mix of both old and new buildings, with changes such as adding stories, subdividing plots, and replacing construction material. The boundaries between public and private spaces in wicks is fluid. The alleys and pathways used for various purposes. Also, building densities increasing significantly, leading to potential overexploitation of common resources like public space, ventilation, and sunlight in many cases. Although villages in the city may appear chaotic and haphazard, they are not entirely unplanned, as they have generally emerged and become consolidated through complex incremental adaptations, which have remained understudied. In our work, we explore the morphogenesis of urban villages by drawing on evidence from multiple case studies in 3 Vietnamese cities, including Hanoi, Da Nang, and Ho Chi Minh City. Adopting a comparative case study research design and using multi-scale urban mapping, we analyzed the formal, informal morphologies at both the metropolitan scale, and also investigated the process of morphogenesis at the neighborhood scale. We noticed that informal morphologies vary in size, shape, and density across cities when it comes to urban villages, influenced by historical and pre-existing conditions. Also, how urban villages show incremental changes in buildings and access network, but initial access network often remaining unchanged over time. Densification in urban villages leading to increased building coverage, but often without new public spaces affecting living conditions, and VICs maintaining strong social capital and cultural norms, influencing conflict resolution and community cohesion over time. Informal appropriations of alleys and public spaces for various activities generally do not block movements and flows of pedestrian movement in particular. And villages in the city undergoing overlapping process of extension, densification, and intensification, driven by self-development and informal subdivisions over time. We also explore the relations between informal and formal morphologies in the context of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City over 120 years. We took a historical perspective here, and the research findings reveal that informal morphologies in both cities have increased at different rates over the observed period of time. We also found that the development of informal formal morphologies vary depending on the distance from the city core to pre-urban areas, and noticed that water bodies such as ponds, rivers, and canals have influenced urban development patterns and the emergence of informal formal morphologies over time. In part of my recent work in slum tourism, we explored the relevant literature on the topic. Slum tourism has become a growing topic in tourism literature, particularly in relation to the global south. We explored the relevant literature on the topic with a focus on its capacities and limitations, looking at slum tourism, or what is known in the relevant literature as slum tourism, and reflected on the potentials for interdisciplinary studies. Some of the key findings of our work included how important is the contextual approaches and local participation in tourism development, and also reflected on the term slum often being used in tourism, referring to substandard informant, the kind of media presentation that can influence tourists' motivations and perceptions in particular, and how constructed images can portray slums as symbols of danger and poverty, fueling an adventurous allure for tourists. Emphasize on bottom-up community-based approaches and focusing on long-term improvements of infrastructure and quality of life in these settlements, and the need to critically reflect on the use of certain terms such as slum tourism in this context to capture the potentials of informal urbanism, particularly its productive capacities, and the overemphasis on the special qualities without considering social context can potentially lead to displacement and gentrification in the future. We also looked at the challenge of understanding visibility and image in the context of informal settlements. The visibility of informal settlements within the urban landscape can have a significant impact on decision over whether and how informal settlements might be upgraded or even demolished. We explore this issue from the perspective of the role of typology, particularly topography and urban morphology, in mediating the gaze from the formal to the informal city. We develop a typology of spatial visibility according to whether the formal gaze is an overview or street view, and whether it is private or public. We discuss different approaches to the transformation of place identity, such as concealing or revealing informal settlements on one hand, and blurring or accentuating informal-formal distinctions on the other. We argue that while a focus on image can easily be superficial, we need to put an end to any notion that question of image and visibility can be ignored. The key issue at stake here is the ways the spatial visibility of informal morphologies is linked to the production of negative place identity, and how the visibility that can stimulate eviction can also be turned into an asset in the transformation of place identity in informal settlements. The question of why certain settlements become visible or remain invisible on maps is geared to the implications of visibility or their invisibility in policymaking, and the role of mapping in unraveling the relations between power and knowledge in this particular case. Drawing on curated juxtaposition of photographs from different places, I also explore the transformation of public spaces and their role in shaping urban environments. One of the central themes I explored was about the evolution and the fluid nature of urban places as they are being made, unmade, and remade over time. The juxtaposition of photographs from different places has highlighted the ongoing process of urban transformation and the role of public places as arenas for appropriation, negotiation, and contestation. My attempt primarily in this project was to explore the complexities of urban places, cutting across geographical boundaries and challenging preconceived notions of place and public space in particular. So where does this leave us? The emerging body of knowledge, to conclude, on forms of urban informality can substantially benefit from more comparative studies, particularly across different places in the context of Global South, as well as more comparative studies exploring cases cutting across the constructed divisions between what is known as the Global South and the Global North cities. Designing, conducting, and also disseminating research on forms of urban informality can pose critical ethical questions to institutional ethics review, research design, fieldwork, and dissemination that we argued elsewhere. While researching urban morphology and morphogenesis can be time-consuming and resource-intensive, a sophisticated understanding of the morphologies and incremental adaptations of informal settlements in particular can inform practice of incremental upgrading, exploring how different forms of informal urbanism, including informal street vending, informal settlements, and informal transport, work in relation to each other and also remains a significant gap and a task for future research. Terminology, it's important to note that, can be challenging when it comes to informal urbanism. Using specific terms is not merely about being politically correct, as terms matter, particularly when it comes to how forms of informality are understood and addressed accordingly across different contexts. Kind of conventional urban design practice, which tend to focus on constructing imagined futures and controlling final formal outcomes. Informality is the arena of adaptation, improvisation, temporality, and negotiation, among others. Forms of informality are in the process of becoming with a capacity to shape open-ended places. Exploring informal urbanism can provide a more sophisticated understanding of the dynamics of individual and collective forms of action and control. What might be perceived as disorder is often a more sophisticated form of order that has not been adequately scrutinized yet. Exploring the dynamics of informal urbanism can also contribute to the development of urban design theory and practice in different ways. For example, exploring how forms of informality work, particularly in the context of Global South, can deterritorialize and expand the body of urban design knowledge. Urban design practice can also more effectively engage with exploring a range of possibilities when it comes to shaping places by focusing more on processes than products. Also, exploring informal urbanism can provide a more nuanced understanding of the dynamics of individual and collective forms of action and control. Focusing more on performance rather than merely investing in prescriptive coding can be considered as one of the key points in this regard. Exploring the capacities and limitations of how informal codes or rules work can further inform the governance of what is known as common pool resources in relation to urban design. Also, investigating how incremental production of space works in informal settlements can provide a better understanding of self-organization and adaptation to inform the exploration of generative processes in urban design thinking and practice. Urban design can also effectively engage with the formation and transformation of informal settlements. Much of the underlying social, cultural, political, and economic issues cannot be addressed merely through urban design. The looser scope of urban design, however, has been subject to appropriation by a range of disciplines and professions. Reflecting of what urban design is not or cannot do is perhaps as important as articulating what urban design is and can do. Urban design cannot be simply reduced to forms of large-scale architecture or small-scale planning. Urban design can at once learn from and contribute to how cycles of change play out in informal settlements and informal urbanism in general. Identifying the key variables and agents is critical to preventing the emergence of slum conditions or self-destruction of diversity. While gentrification might enhance mixing disadvantaged enclaves, it can also lead to forms of displacement and place transformation over time. Urban design can effectively engage with practice of informal settlement upgrading. At stake here is the development of a sophisticated understanding of how forms of informality work. Before jumping to any conclusion about appropriate urban design interventions, community engagement is, of course, critical, yet it's also important to note that for urban to critically reflect on the opportunities and challenges associated with community engagement, particularly when it comes to managing intersecting desires and fears through participatory process of design and co-production of urban space. Adopting an outcome-focused approach to urban design and prescribing fixed solutions often falls short in addressing the nuances of how forms of informality work. Fixation on the final form also runs the risk of reducing informality to merely a physical product. And urban design can play a key role in this regard, as the dynamics of visibility have become integral to how certain meanings are being constructed, framed, and communicated through the built environment. Informal settlements work at intersections of materiality and expression, as well as spatiality and sociality. While what is being communicated is as significant as what is not being conveyed when it comes to the production and consumption of meanings in place, it is important to note that attempts to transform place identities in informal settlements often incorporate revealing or concealing forms of informality on one hand, and or accentuating or blurring the distinctions between the two on the other. Reduce urban informality to a range of constructed images, practice of place transformation often merely engage with how informal settlements appear and or become visible or noticeable. And last but not least, would be important to look at urban design education. While informal urbanism has become at once a key challenge of urbanization and integral to how places work, addressing the critical question of informality in urban design has remained long overdue. The future of urbanism largely takes place in less formal and more congested cities of the global south. Becoming informal in the city future narratives, which tend to valorize formality, is particularly at stake, as it has the capacity to uncover a range of underexplored possibilities concerning the formation and transformation of urban places. I would finish here, and thanks everyone for bearing with me till the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Hesam. Can you unshare? Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for some questions and discussion. Those of you who are online, could you just register your desire to ask a question, and then we will go to you, or maybe put your hand up if you choose to. You've covered a lot of ground there, Hesam, and I'm not sure we're going to cover that much in the questions. But I'll open it up first of all to people who are here face to face. Anyone who wants to start? David.
So, Hesam, I'm particularly interested in what you finished on, which is I guess, mostly we see the transfer of knowledge from the formal West into, the global South. And we rarely see the global South as a place of innovation, which could benefit more formal cities in the global North. So when you showed us the slide of a pathway and you described how that had to be flexible and that was negotiated, and people need that. In that case, poor people needed that space. It seemed very different from what we see happening in the newspapers here, which is where people try and do something neighborly, like start a little library, or I saw recently a person in Queensland, they planted vegetables out on their front lawn and invited people to, take them. And they were told by the council this was a health hazard, and they had to rip it all out. Another case, the council left for months a big hole in the public domain. Somebody filled it in and planted grass on top of it, and then they were hit with a fine for touching public property. So there seems to be a real and present problem in our over-formalized society. Do you see these flows actually potentially emerging, or are the institutional obstacles too great?
Yes, great. That's actually a great question. I think that's one of the key, capacities of exploring, studying, and making research on informal urbanism more and more visible, because it has the potential to inform how we look not only at cities of the global south, the issues of informal urbanism in those contexts, but also how we design and approach planning our cities in the global north in particular. I think as you mentioned, that's a shift of mindset might be perhaps the key point there, that how we can move away from an entirely rigid formal framework that governs everything, or what is known as over-formalization or over-regulation of how urban planning and urban design plays out in cities, and moving more towards a kind of solutions that work at the intersections of formality and informality. So not entirely informal, not entirely formal, exploring how informality can become formality and the other way around, exploring particularly the intersections of formal and informal solutions. Some of the intervention approaches in parts of the cities in the global south have tried to use that kind of thinking to propose particular planning and design interventions, but of course it's hardly a common practice across different places when we look at the prevalence of the issues and the range of challenges associated with that. But definitely that's one of the key takeaways, I think, from researching informal urbanism that we can consider when it comes to how we think about planning and designing our cities elsewhere.
Thank you.
Ash.
Thanks, Hesam. This is a very comprehensive presentation, and you definitely covered a lot of grounds. So I'm interested in the visual. I mean, some of the commentaries on the visibilizing of slums, because in my own research, I'm interested in, particularly in recent time, I'm interested in how to visualize slum life, not really slum and the physicality of slum, but how to visualize, for example, care practices within slums, how to positively visualize women's contribution in informal economies. So, but I'm not really interested in mapping per se, but sorry for that. But you mentioned that visibilizing slum sort of like cuts open the negative image of the slum that leads to eviction. Then you also mentioned about slum tourism. So that's also a kind of objectification of slum life and slum aesthetics. And also that kind of aesthetic is also used, I mean, that negative aesthetic is used to attract aid. So in a way, this visualization has a lot of negativities around it, and that actually benefits in a lot of ways. But can you think of any positive kind of visibilizing of slums, and that kind of contributes positively to the slum life and the things we celebrate about slums? Yeah, sorry for the long question.
No, that's all right. That's also a great question. I think the question of visibility is in particular a complex and multi-layer question. I think as part of our work, we looked at the intricate dynamics of the concept, particularly in relation to informal urbanism. So what we argued is that visibility is a double-sided coin. So it's not entirely negative, it's not entirely positive. It has its own capacities and challenges. So I guess if we want to focus on the positive or more promising aspects of visibility, one of them is to enable the documentation of informal forms of informal urbanism, which can also help empowering communities and also making their practices more and more visible. However, that visibility can also be misused by authorities in particular who are interested in forms of identification, eradication, demolition, etc. when it comes to informal urbanism. So what I'm saying is that usually visibility is not only focusing on positive or negative aspects. It often has its own capacities and challenges, and making research on informal urbanism visible has its own ethical challenges and consideration that we need to think about. The extent to which our attempt at making practice of informal street vending, informal transport, or informal settlement visible can be used or misused in a range of different ways is more of an ethical question when it comes to exploring informal urbanism. So yeah, I think to sum it up, it has both its capacities and challenges when it comes to visibility of informal urbanism.
Excellent. Thanks, Hesam.
Question.
Yeah.
Hesam, thanks for that presentation. I was just really struck by the the visual and the colors of the maps. It was really a beautiful presentation. I do research on the politics of participation, and so I'm really interested in the relationship between process and outcome, or process or product, as you were describing it. But I was really struck at the end of your presentation, your kind of assertion or comment on community participation and community engagement, which seems to me can describe a very sort of formalization. It's a formalization of a process that is otherwise, in the cases that you're describing, quite informal. And so I was just wondering how you are kind of squaring or thinking through this idea of community engagement in terms of who sanctions those spaces, who owns those spaces, those processes, who's invited, who's not, who's in, who's out. So it just feels like when we talk about community engagement, my thinking often goes into a formal kind of conceptualization of it. So I was just wondering how you're thinking about community engagement.
Yes, that's also a great question. Thank you. Yes, so my work in particular looked at community participation or engagement in the context of informal urbanism, but from the experience of looking at how negotiation for space and visibility works, particularly in relation to street vending, informal transport, and informal urbanism, we notice some interesting issues that can potentially inform how we approach community participation. One of that I think I touched upon at the end of the presentation was this idea of the role of the built environment professions when it comes to facilitating facilitating community participation and empowering communities. Because in many cases, we may face challenging decisions when it comes to facilitating those processes. When members of community want something that might not be in the interests of the broader neighborhood or the city or the district. So to give you a very concrete example, in a very small scale informal settlement, when there's going to be a prospect for formalization or a particular intervention in place, what if members of the community at settlement? What is the role of the built environment professions when it comes to certain desires or particular requests from members of the community? So that kind of challenging decisions raise questions about the role of professional knowledge in relation to the role of tacit and more ordinary forms of knowledge production, and how these two can be merged in a sense together to co-produce places that are not only working at the scale of a settlement, but also working well at the larger scales, at the district scale, not producing more disconnectivity or impermeability at larger scales, particularly both at district and city scales. So that kind of discussion is quite important here. And that was mainly the point that I referred to towards the end of the presentation. I'm sure it's not an answer to the question, but I think it provides more reflection on what I included at the end.
Okay, just as we run out of time, we've got a quick question here. I'm going to read it out. From Sipta Hadi, who's from Indonesia, is online, and I want to ask a question. He says that people often ask me while discussing informality, whether it's the informal economy or settlements and housing, does all informality need to be formalized? What is your opinion about formalizing idea? I'm not sure how long we've got to answer this. Hesam, do you want to have a one-sentence response?
Just like that.
I think that seems impossible, but it's really, I think, a multi-layered, again, great question there. It's not possible to answer it in a few sentences, but I think not necessarily. However, we need to consider that without recognition, people might be disadvantaged, particularly those who are living in informal settlements, or those whose lives depend on, and livelihoods also depend on, forms of informality. So again, it's not a quite simple, straightforward question to consider. I think there are lots of layers to consider when it comes to forms of formalization. And when we talk about formalization, we need to talk about what kind of formalization, because that can come in range of different ways, with range of different purposes, and practiced through many different ways across different contexts.
Okay, thanks, Hesam. I think we need to call this to a close now. I think you've opened up many, many more questions than we can possibly address here. Thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming in, and for all of those online who have joined us, and those who are here face to face. Then you might come and join us for a beer at the Clyde afterwards. Unfortunately, Hesam, like we can't invite you for a beer at this stage.
Too early for beer points.
We can invite him, you just can't come.
It's probably time for breakfast. Just time for breakfast. So thank you again, and thank you all for coming along. And let's hope it's the start of these conversations rather than the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone.